Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Birch and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. We'd like to thank the Preservation Association of Lincoln today for sponsoring this lecture. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. Our membership is available online at preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Becky Martin. Becky is a retired school teacher, 33 years with Lincoln Public Schools. She is also a Preservation Association of Lincoln board member with her husband, Gere. The topic, Becky's topic today is titled The Family of the Gere Carriage House, and it's also featured in an article in the latest PAL newsletter, which is also available online at preservelincoln.org. Please join me in welcoming Becky Martin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This topic began in early January when I read an article in the Lincoln Journal-Star newspaper by Linda Ulrich, and she had an article titled Urban Barns. And I thought it'd be real interesting for the Preservation newsletter to have an article on the family behind one of these urban barns or carriage houses. And so when I was reading the article, Ed Zimmer had noticed that carriage houses are urban barns. And basically a carriage house, for some of us that did not live in the days of horse and buggy, it's a horse and buggy that people traveled around in from place to place before the automobile. And these carriage houses would hold a horse, 2 or 3, depending on the family's needs and the carriage that attached to the horse. And there's about 2 or 3 dozen still standing, Ed estimates, and that would not be very many when you consider how many there probably was at one time. Most of these are built in the late 1800s, possibly early 1900s for a few of the newer ones. Ed has not done a survey yet, and so I think that should be a project of his down the road to inventory and see how many carriage houses we do have. When my husband and I walk, we see carriage houses in Woods Park frequently. If we head over toward near south, we see them, etc. Well, I got started with the Gere family because Ed suggested the Gere Carriage House would make a good article, and it's located in the 800 block of D Street. And I thought, well, I just retired after teaching at Park Middle School just a couple blocks down the street from there. But I was first thinking, what does that look like? And then I realized, well, I've seen it, but I didn't think a whole lot of it, I guess, because it's way in the back of a property. It's in front of a little 1920s bungalow. And I thought, well, that doesn't quite go together because usually by the 20s they were building garages. And so Ed went on to explain to me that the carriage house was built in the 1890s. I've since found out it's built about 1892. And the houses that are in front of this row of bungalows, the whole street, were built much later. Well, come to find out that the house was moved. The current house and carriage house is owned by Colin and Deborah Keefe, and they have been very gracious for Clark and I to go on the property and take photos of the carriage house. Someday we'd like to get inside also. Well, I guess the current house was moved over south near 24th and Van Dorn. So when you look and you see this house, I still had lots of questions and puzzlement because I was thinking that house doesn't look like something that goes with the carriage house over on D Street. This house, though, was built in 1892 with the carriage house. And we'll talk about more later how it really is the house, but what was all done to it in the move. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the family, and then we'll go into some more photos of the house and carriage house. The Gere family consisted of the father, Charles Henry Gere. The mother was Mary E. Clapham, and E, I think, was Elizabeth, but I haven't verified that yet. The son, you may be wondering what she got going on here, but it's John Putnam Gere or George Parnell Gere, and I've seen it a couple different ways, and I'll explain that mystery later. So they did only have the one son, though. And then they did have 3 daughters. They had Mariel Clapham Gere, Ellen Bladen Gere, and Frances Clapham Gere. And all 3 daughters grew up in this house and grew to love this house. In fact, they lived pretty much their entire lives in the house that we just saw on the prior slide. Now, I love genealogy, and therefore the history kind of ties in, and I was really interested in trying to figure out something about the Gere family. Their name was spelled G-E-E-R at one time instead of the G-E-R-E. And the Tracy line, surname line of this family goes way back. And I did find this little statement I thought you might find interesting. It's a copy of Father's letter to Uncle George. That would be Charles's brother, George. And it was written in one of the daughters' handwriting. It was dated 1896, April 17th, 1896. And it was regarding family history that George had requested. And it says, I searched back as far as the 3rd century, that was on that Tracy surname side, until I pulled up a lot of disreputable people and concluded to stop right there. So I don't know if I should do that with my genealogy or not when I come across somebody that's not a very good name to them. But Charles Gere, as you can tell, was a character. He was a pretty famous Nebraskan, I found out, because the only thing I knew about the Gere name was, well, we had a library in town called Gere Library, and that's all I knew. I was very uneducated on this family and the importance they played in the early history of Lincoln. He was born in Gainesville, New York, 1834, to Horatio Nelson Gere and to Julia DeLay Grant. And he was educated at first in the public schools. Then he went to an Oxford Academy there in New York. And after that graduation, he went on to Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, graduating there in 1861. He taught school in Baltimore, Maryland for a while, but he also, his main interest then was to attend law school, which he did while he taught. But, you know, you're catching the dates, 1861, well, that's the time of the Civil War. And so he enlisted in Maryland's 10th Infantry. Now, he enlisted June of 1863, mustered out then in January of 1864. So he wasn't in very long. Didn't sound like he saw much action in that time of service. But since I did the newsletter, I also found out he also enlisted one more time. And this time he saw action in the Battle of Monocacy. It was an emergency 100-day infantry, the 11th Infantry of Maryland, that was put together because they had found out the South was going to try and take over D.C., Washington, D.C. And I was reading up on that a little bit, and the main job for this infantry was to stall the Confederate forces so they couldn't go in and take D.C. In the meantime, the Union could get more troops there and protect the capital. Just a little side note here, the general was Lew Wallace. That was the general that Charles served under. And Lew Wallace, I don't know if that rings a name to anybody. It did my husband. He wrote Ben-Hur. So he served under the general that wrote Ben-Hur. So I thought that was a little trivia. That was interesting. Now, after the war, Charles was admitted to the bar, okay, in Maryland. Now, in the meantime, got to backtrack a little bit, the family was moving west, his family, his own personal family. In 1857, they moved west. And there was a little deal. It said that his father lost the property in New York due to a patent right affair. So there must have been some legal issue with the title of the property, and he lost it in New York. So they moved to this little town, that star there, that's Table Rock, roughly, in Pawnee County, Nebraska, and the family moved there. And there are, I think, about 3 or 4 diaries that are available in the State Historical Society collection that is on the family's move west that I did not have time to read but would be very interesting, I think, about their travels west. After they got here, shortly after, he lost a sister. Now, Charles did not come with them because, remember, he's back in college and then serving in the war. But he lost a sister. Another sister died shortly after that. His dad died in 1862. He was a farmer there, listed in the 1860 census as farming. And then I think the brother was about 1870. He died in an Indian uprising in Solomon, Kansas. And he died then. And I think the mother, though, she died in 1875. So the family there was a brother, George, left, and of course Charles back east, and then a sister-in-law that was married to John, who died in the Indian Uprising, and their son. So that was the only survivors by the time the year 1875 rolls around. Charles, though, when he came west, was about 1865. So about 8 years later, here comes Charles. He's going to visit his mother. And several places, the story goes, he got off at Brownville and he just loved what he saw. He liked it so much, he decided to stay. So he sent for all his things and had them shipped here. He opened a law office in Pawnee City, which isn't far from Table Rock. You can see the family stayed really close by. And he eventually was partners there with David Butler. And David Butler, at least I knew that name, was the first governor of Nebraska. I don't know the second governor, but I knew David Butler. So he was actually a law partner with David Butler. And realizing that in 1865 or so, Nebraska's not a state yet. It's all coming into being. It's still a territory. And so by 1867, though, he does move to Lincoln. And he's elected to the first legislature. And he was several different little short terms there. He was private secretary to Governor Butler for a while. He was a member of the Constitutional Convention for Nebraska, and he establishes the first newspaper here in Lincoln. From what I found out about with that first newspaper, though, is that it was called the Commonwealth, and it wasn't even printed here because we didn't have any printing equipment. He borrowed equipment from some places, and it was printed elsewhere for a while. It was called the Commonwealth. Then when it, about 1869, it became the Nebraska State Journal. And he was president of the paper until he died in 1904. This building here, Jim McHugh said the picture was made about in the 1920s, and it included several additions to the original building. But it's on the same site as the current Journal-Star building is today. He gave up his law practice, though, in 1870 because he was really interested in politics and his newspaper. Now, legislative credits. This man, this is why he was important in Lincoln's history. He was one of the people, of course, that was pushing for the state capitol to be here. But once it was here, he wanted the university. He wanted it all. The lunatic asylum, as they called the regional center in those days, and he wanted the state prison to be located here. And he pushed those through, and they were all located here in Lincoln. He drafted legislation related to the railroads. And another thing there, I looked at one map, too, at one point. It's interesting. All 4 railroads went through Lincoln. So he made sure that Lincoln was a very important city. And then the Gere Library thing, there'll be a couple of reasons why the library was named after him. One thing, in state legislation, he promoted free libraries in Nebraska and pushed through some legislation that allowed that to happen more easily. So even across the state, he was promoting a free library system. Now, other positions he served are very numerous, but I thought I'd list a few for you. He was 4 terms as chair of the Republican State Committee. I had read that the Nebraska State Journal tended to be Republican in nature. Well, that explains why here, besides being in Nebraska. And he was appointed to the University Board of Regents, and he served about 10 years with the Board of Regents, and he was on the building committee for the new library there, too. He's very wanted a library, a new library building. He was on that committee to determine the designs and the architect, et cetera. And that building's still standing today, and we know it as Architectural Hall. So he was very instrumental with Architectural Hall also. He was postmaster of Lincoln for about 4 years if he didn't have enough to do otherwise. And he was considered founder of, by many, of Lincoln's library. In those days, of course, we had one, and he was considered the founder of it because since 1875, all but 4 years up until his death, he was president of the Lincoln Library Board, too. So, and I also read that he helped acquire a lot of their holdings, their books. So he was very instrumental in Lincoln's free library. Now, he died in 1904, and the family is buried at Wyuka, of course, and they're in Section 13, and anybody that's taken a tour with Ed knows Section 13 is a pretty elaborate section. Many fancy headstones and monuments to people around Lincoln and in the state. And, but the Gere family, they're all buried there, and you'll see they all have the same marker. It's a flat marker, and his is the only one that's a little fancier, and that's just because he has the Grand Army of the Republic marker above his name. And for Section 13, there's no Gere family marker. In fact, the first time I went over there, there was still some snow on the ground. I assumed I'd see a big marker, and I couldn't find it because they were all covered with snow. Wyuka records indicate he died of Angulus petrus. That took me on a little fun history search. Even John Sliker, a former bird member that works in the museum, the medical center, nobody had heard of this, so it must be misspelled or all put together in one word. But in his obits, there are a couple different mentions of neuralgia, angina pectoris, so I'm assuming it was something to do with his heart. He had some sort of coronary heart disease. He was 66 years of age when he died. Now, as a teacher, I found it very interesting. When the day he died, the afternoon, they closed the schools in his honor and respect. So in Lincoln, they closed the schools. Now, the other part that was interesting, the article went on to say, is that the principal sat the school children down and talked to them, explaining that we weren't just getting a day off. This was out of honor and respect for Mr. Gere. As a teacher, I don't know how much he got through to them. They probably thought it was a day off. But anyways, you know, it was that interesting. They did close the whole system down. He was that important. His obit, I'd like to read to kind of sum up Charles' life. I'd like to read a little bit from his obit written in 1904 in the Lincoln Evening News at that time it was called. He was more of a student than a man of affairs, yet few men had so comprehensive and intelligent grasp of life as it swirled about him and in the great world. An omnivorous reader, his brain was a reservoir of knowledge that made a personal communion with him delightful, and the editorial page over which he presided, one of the strongest in the West. Cheeriness and gentleness were his two strongest personal characteristics, and they endeared him to all with whom he came into contact. So that sums up Charles Henry Gere. Now, he did marry, and he married Mariel E. Clapham. And they were married in 1871 in D.C., and I find that rather interesting because if you remember back what I told you about Charles, 1867, he's moving to the little city of Lincoln. And as far as I know, he didn't do a lot of traveling back east and forth, and he may have done some. But odds are they must have kept in contact with letters. And I was wondering, though, how did he meet her? You know, was it because he lived in Baltimore, but he moved here about 1865. So I did find in one of Mariel's obits, because the different papers would have little different obits each one, and it paid to kind of look as many as I could, because in the one that was not sourced, that's in the State Historical Society collection, it said that Mariel in 1871 married a young man she had first met when he was a Union soldier in the Maryland Regiment. So they did meet, and I bet they kept the correspondence going over the years, and he then went out there and married her. She was the daughter of Captain John Clapham and Mariel Goodwin, and I don't know anything at this point about her family, siblings. I don't even know what's he a captain of. I was unable to find any information at this point on the Clapham family, but sounds like they were members of D.C. for quite a while. Now, Mariel was born in 1838 in D.C. Her main purpose in life, as most women in those days, was the care of her family, taking care of the home and the family. But I was able to glean a little bit about her. She was a charter member of the Lotus Club, and I'd never heard of the Lotus Club, and so I had to do some digging on that. The Lotus Club was first called the Avon Club, and they studied Shakespeare. It was founded in November 1880, and they was a group of 17 women, and that was a study group on Shakespeare. But over the years, it's evolved as a women's group still, but it's a variety of topics, just like a lot of groups today. So it's not just one topic. The name was eventually changed to the Lotus Club. And in the newspaper, there's lots of little clippings. And as you can imagine with your dad owning a newspaper, that the family has lots of small little clippings like they were guests of, they visited, they're hosting, you know, whatever. There was just a lot of those. And the one thing about this women's club is that it was always listed like as a study group. So it's supposed to be more educational in nature. They were active members, and she was considered an active member of the Church of the Holy Trinity. One of her obits says, Mrs. Gere had been a communicant of Holy Trinity Episcopal Church almost from its organization, and no member was more universally beloved. And so she was a member for over 40 years of the Church of the Holy Trinity. And another, just to read an example of a tidbit I found, that in 1910, on the State Journal, it said, the Linen Circle of the Parish Guild will meet Friday at Mrs. Gere's residence. So she was acting like a lot of women in a circle group of some sort, and they did a lot for the uptake of the care of the church. She passed away April 4th, 1912. Her marker is just like her husband's. Burial's at Wyuka. This medical condition she had was erysipelas, if I'm saying it close to right. It's a skin condition caused by a species of strep that affects especially the face with lesions. And so it sounded like a horrible death. One of the obits said that Mrs. Gere entered with her husband into the life of the little city, referring to Lincoln, and was soon an integral part of it. She was a woman of intellectual power and much grace and charm. She occupied a place in the social life of Lincoln which can never be duplicated. So now you know that was probably her most important part in her married life. Funeral services were at the Church of the Holy Trinity, and I, of course, had to sidetrack a little bit about the Church of the Holy Trinity. Ed Zimmer was kind to share a couple photos. The one on the left is the church, and the one on the right is the church after the fire. The church started actually about 1869, shortly after we became a state. It's one of the oldest Episcopal churches in the state, and probably the oldest one in Lincoln. It was located at 12th and J, and this building on the left was built in 1888, and then the fire destroyed it in 1957. So I don't remember this church. Now I know why. I was only a couple years old, but it was a beautiful church, and the family was very active in it. Now, this is what's on that site today. It would be on the northeast corner, and it's Farmers Mutual, Nebraska, is on that site today. And I want to show you something that I found out, that if you look, hang on, I've got to get this right. Right here is a planter, and there's a planter. On those planters by the front door are some signs about the church. And I thought that was kind of interesting that they list the site of Holy Trinity Episcopal Church. Hawkins is the architect, which many of us have heard Ed Zimmer speak on before. And again, it says it was built in 1888, burned in 1957. So I thought that was a little interesting sidetrack. The Gere homes were at the 800 block, 849D. The home prior to that was at 1700J. So you can see how this was kind of in the middle and very important to their life in the community because they always lived close to this church. Now, I'd like to go over with the son. Here's my dilemma here. I didn't know exactly. I am assuming John Putnam Gere would be his name. His burial at Wyuka is marked as such. But when I looked at the Wyuka books, they got out the old books for me, and it says George P. Gere. So I thought, well, good grief. And then the birth doesn't give a name. It says in the Daily Journal, Mr. Gere, our senior, is the fond parent of a bouncing boy. Boys are always bouncing for some reason. The anxiety and a care of a father rest lightly upon his broad shoulders. And that was written in July 9th of 1872 in the paper. And then the Daily State Journal listed the sad event also. April 12th, 1873, died in this city George Parnell, infant son of Charles H. and Mariel E.C. Gere, aged 9 months and 4 days. And it's the same The dates are all fit the same for the headstone, so I'm not quite sure where we fit on this. So the mystery continues, but we'll assume it's probably John Putnam Gere. John was the name of Charles' brother, and George was also a name of Charles' brother. So they're both familiar names. From his dad's obit booklet, I wanted to read this to you because I found it interesting, just not only about the family, but also about Waiuka. A small grave by the side of the large one already contained the ashes of an infant son, Mr. and Mrs. Gere, who had been buried in a small lot at the south end of Waiuka a little more than 31 years ago, and that would have been by the fence on O Street somewhere, which wasn't there at the time. And it had just been removed to this larger lot in the center of the cemetery, which would be section 13. And when the baby was buried, the place was a bleak prairie without a tree in sight larger than a child's wrist. The contrast between desolate burial 31 years ago and the beauty of the scene yesterday, that would be in 1904 at Charles's funeral, when the sun flickered through a forest of almost mature trees and smiled over a green and gold landscape, was almost beyond belief. So that was an interesting description, I thought, of Waiuka, how it had changed in its beginning years. And it was interesting, too, that they moved the family across the cemetery, so, or George or John, whatever his name was, across over to be with the family. I thought that was kind of interesting to do. And I also noticed they said ashes, and I've always wondered if he had some sort of possible disease, too, because in those days, cremation usually wasn't the course of action families took. Now, this is a photo of Mariel Gere from the State Historical Society collection with her daughters. And it's, let's see if I can do this right again. It's Alan, and this is Mother Mariel, daughter Mariel, and then Frances. And they all lived to adulthood, and they were very active with their family in the community. One 1900 newspaper article mentioned that the whole family was the new members of the Nebraska Art Association because they were helping host an exhibit here in Lincoln. So the family did a lot of things together. They each have their own unique things, as you'll see in a minute, but they were all very active with the community. The State Historical Society has 19 boxes of information on documents on the Gere family alone. So if anybody's interested to delve through all of those, that would be a fun project. There's about a dozen or so photo boxes, too. I kind of skimmed through those looking for a few of these photos and photos of the houses. And, but there's photos of a variety of family and neighbors and friends of the family, too, in the collection. Now this one is just of the daughters, and it's Alan, Mariel, and Frances. And all the sisters have some things in common. One, they all went to the University of Nebraska. And, you know, graduating in the late 1800s, that was a pretty good feat for a family of girls to all be doing that. So education was very important in this family. They were all members of Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority. And there's a lot of little tidbits in the paper about them coming and going to some affair to do with that. They were all members of the Lotus Club, which is the club that the mother chartered back in 1880, so they all became members of that study group. There were just many social outings mentioned in the paper. One I thought was interesting, and they were all invited to a swimming party at the sanitarium, and I should have included the picture of that on my slides because it's a neat old building that was located in the center of Lincoln. They had a Daughters of American Revolution chapter, DAR chapter here back then, and of course they were members of that. And the 125th anniversary of Bunker Hill was celebrated at a big party, and it said that that Frances and Ellen assisted as the hostess in their white dresses. So they were always mentioned as helping out with something or another in the paper. Now, the real interesting thing with these sisters isn't that. Now, none of the girls married. They all stayed single their entire life. But what made it really fascinating was that they adopted as babies a boy and a girl and raised them as their own. The boy and girl were born in 1914, 1915, and if they adopt them as babies, it'd be shortly thereafter. So, you know, for that time, I think even today, but, you know, even for that time especially, to to raise these two children as their own. I don't have any clue on their parentage. I haven't done extensive research to, determine if they were family members, like a little second cousin or something or another. I know enough to know they're not first cousins, I don't believe, but I don't know the Clapham side of the household, okay? But on the Gere side. So I thought I'd just kind of sidetracked here before I talk about each sister and just tell you a little bit about this boy and this girl they adopted. The girl was Elizabeth Frances Gere, was her probably adopted name. She went by Betty, and this is from the 1932 yearbook. And one thing that I found was that Miss Ellen Gere, in one of her obits, said, "Intense love of children led the Mrs. Gere, sometimes after the death of their parents, to adopt a baby boy and a baby girl who have grown to maturity, married, and have each a young daughter." And then in 1923, there was a big spread on Mariel Gere, and it said, "Because Miss Mariel Gere and her sisters have an inborn love for children, two tiny ones, a brother and a sister, found a wonderful home a few years ago and are growing up in the atmosphere of love and kindness into which they came before old enough to remember any other." So this is the daughter, Betty. And Betty was born April 24th, 1914 in Omaha. Again, I don't know parentage. She was pictured, I found an article where she was pictured in the 1934 Journal Star paper. Caption states she left for Boulder where she'll attend the University of Colorado. And I don't know if she ever finished there or not, but I do know the family traveled to Estes Park a lot and seemed to have a house or a cabin there probably. And they traveled quite a bit because there'd be little tidbits. Mariel, Frances, and Ellen returned back from Estes Park today. Or Frances and Ellen took Betty and John to Estes Park. Mariel joined them later. And one even said that they arrived at Estes Park, but it was a little bit later than expected due to the muddy roads. So, I know they were back and forth there a lot. In fact, I think Betty actually lived most of her life later on out there, and she died at Estes Park in 1992. I do know she married a Robert Clark Headland in 1935, and they had a daughter, Frances Ann. And I did finally find a little bit about Robert because I was always wondering, they always referred to her as Mrs. Betty Headland, and usually in the paper they'll say the husband's name in those days, if he survives. And I found out that he passed away in 1949. He was a first lieutenant in the Marines at Okinawa, Japan, so he died during the war. Then the son, John C. Gere, this is from one of my 1934 yearbooks I have of Lincoln High, and he was married. I know a little bit about him, but not a lot. He had a daughter, Johnnie Kay, Jonnie, C-A-Y, not K-A-Y, C-A-Y. He was married and I think divorced to a Mary. He could have remarried again, I'm not sure. But I did find that he died in Estes Park, Colorado in 1987. And not only was his sister there, in 1958 I did find that Mr. and Mrs. John Gere took their daughter, Mrs. Jack Gartner, and granddaughter to their home in Estes Park. So I'm assuming their daughter must have lived there too, and so, the family was very connected to Estes Park, and I'm assuming he went there in his later years to live. I did find one tragic thing out about John, and it said that in the Evening State Journal, November 21st, 1938, Leonard Lake meets death. Well, he was a Journal employee. He's killed Monday while hunting. And he was hunting at the Herb Ayler Farm. It's 3 miles southeast of Cheney. And it mentioned that John Gere was hunting with him. He was an apprentice printer at the Journal. And it sounds like they had a large flock of pigeons they scared out of the barn. And then they were running out to go shoot them, I guess. And supposedly John tripped, and his gun went off killing because he was behind Leonard Lake and killing him in the back. Now, the sheriff ruled that Gere was blameless, and it was one of those regrettable accidents that happened while hunting. I did find a little bit later in 1940, though, that there was a lawsuit by Leonard Lake's widow for a $50,000 negligent suit, but Gere was found innocent again with that suit, that it was just one of those accidents that happened while hunting. But I'm sure it was hard to live with. So that's what I know about the two children at this point that was adopted by the Gere sisters. Now a little bit about the Geres. Mariel was born in 1874. Her write-up in the paper says, "Our worthy chief, Mr. Gere, rejoices in being the father of an 8.5-pound daughter who opened her little eyes to the light of day about 4 o'clock Tuesday afternoon." And so she wasn't bouncing, though, you know, like her brother was. But it was mentioned in the obit for Mariel later on that this was her only proof when she wanted to get her passport. Now, she was quite the world traveler and needed that passport. And I have a feeling that's probably what all the sisters probably had to do, because back in 1874 there weren't state records by any means, and the county records usually started for births a little bit later. So that was her proof of birth at that time. She graduated in 1895, like I said, from the university, but it was the Industrial College with the General Scientific Group. And then she got her master a few years later. She was a science teacher is what she ended up being. And while she was in college, though, she was friends with Willa Cather. There's quite a few of the letters are in the State Historical Society collection with the Gere family. There's been books written on that with her friendship with Willa Cather. In fact, even in the photograph collection, there's some pictures of Willa with the family photos that were probably given to them. Also to note that Willa Cather was published early on in the Nebraska State Journal that Mariel's father owned. She was on the board of directors and for the Nebraska State Journal and the Lincoln City Library Board, and I think she became on those boards when her father died in 1904, because it appears that Mariel kind of took over as head of household. Census record, she's listed as such, but also just with all the activities she was doing, she kind of took the spots that her father vacated with his death. She belonged to several other groups around town. She was a science teacher, so she belonged to things like I did, like the State Education Association, groups like that. But she did love to travel. She'd even take a semester off or a year off from teaching here and there to do her travels. It'd be kind of nice to be able to afford to do that as a teacher today. But she had the money coming in from the journal, so I'm sure that helped with that little hobby. In the 1934 yearbook, it was dedicated to her, and it was a full-page photograph. And I'm going to step away a minute if you want to start those around. If you want to, those of you that like old books and things can look at the 1934 yearbook. It does show her photo. Her adopted son John is also in there, also listed with the seniors. But they're just interesting to look at in general. I'd like to just read the one sentence that caught my eye, or part of a sentence, because she was a favorite teacher, and this is why. Because she greets students' idiosyncrasies with complete understanding. And I even found a newspaper article later on in the Star that said they loved her because she understood them and always knew how to help them. So it was very interesting. She taught in Falls City, I think, for a couple years prior to 1900. She was also at the university just a little bit with the science, but from about 1900 to 1941, she taught at Lincoln High School and taught science. So I found that very interesting, that she kept up her career, even being on the board of directors for a couple things. She also, for many, many years at Lincoln High, you'll find in a lot of the yearbooks, she was the chemistry club sponsor, and this is from 1940. She retired in 41, so this is the year before she retired. She is right here above the C in her name. This is an autograph that I kind of pasted right here from another yearbook that I have that she signed for a student. I have quite a few Lincoln High yearbooks, so I was kind of looking through, and I found one with her signature. And but this big chemistry club, you kind of think, gee, a big chemistry club. Well, I'm surprised it's not bigger. Wait till I tell you what it said about the chemistry club in the yearbook. Such things as imploding balls filled with liquid air, testing blood-soaked handkerchiefs for human blood, or displaying modern plastics. form topics for the chemistry club meetings. And then it went on to say the cocoa made over Bunsen burners served after the meetings along with sandwiches also carries out a practical application of chemistry apparatus. So even I would probably want to join this chemistry club. And she also wrote her own chemistry textbook. And she used it with her students. I don't know how many public school teachers today are using a textbook they wrote. Probably very rare. College, yes, but high school, no. Now, Mariel died in 1960. She has listed as cause of death myocarditis, so something to do with the heart, I'm sure. And in 1960, with one of the obits, they had a lot on Mariel, all her accolades, etc., and travels and that kind of thing. But the one that caught my eye was this one. It said, with such a remarkable parent, referring to all her father's accolades, fame was guaranteed Miss Gere if she decided to sit at home and sew. Miss Gere did not. So I like that one. Now, Ellen Bladen Gere, she is born in 1875. They traveled. These sisters traveled a lot, whether together or separately, varied. But Alan and Frances were both part of the Tuesday Travel Club. Our senior, Mr. Gere, rejoices at the increased family caused by addition hereto of a fine 8-pound girl on Thursday morning last. And I think she kept things hopping, even though it took me a little bit to find some things out about her from all those little tidbit articles because her obit didn't mention all the things she was active in. She was quite the speaker. It said for the Tuesday Travel Club in 1910 that she and Ellen recited an original poem, and they did this at the Spalding House, which is at 2221 Sheridan on the National Register. That's where the first annual banquet of the Tuesday Travel Club was held. Another little tidbit in 21 said, Tuesday Travel Club 1 o'clock luncheon with Mrs. Upson at 3326W. Miss Gere will have a paper on the ancient history of Persia. And then in 39, she spoke on travel in Japan. So pretty diverse topics there. But my favorite topic wasn't given at the Travel Club. This was given at the 1914 annual meeting of the patrons of the high school, of Lincoln High School. She spoke on the educational value of moving pictures. I thought that was rather fun. And then a Mr. Mays, I don't know who he was, but he told of another high school in Ohio that was using moving pictures as part of their educational system. So, of course, at the meeting, the big push was for Lincoln High to buy a moving picture machine. And they were told how much they needed it. And I didn't follow up to see, in the next year if they did get this moving picture machine, but I have a feeling they did. She even spoke in 1922 to another women's group of some sort that on the topic of the tendencies of modern architecture in America. So quite the range of topics here. She was involved with the suffrage movement and the League of Women Voters. After that, she, what I could find with Ellen is it's mainly involved hosting dinners and that sort of thing, or hosting a meeting. And her obit said her chief charge was the boy. In fact, the two girls, Ellen and Frances, Ellen would donate to the War Orphans Fund during World War I in France, and Ellen would say, let's say $20 for Betty, or for John, excuse me. And then Frances would do the same, $20 for Betty, and they would donate in their names. Ellen died in 1941. Cause of death was uterine cancer. Her obit says, but the chief interest of Miss Ellen Gere was in her home, in maintaining the traditional generosity and hospitality of her parents, and in the upbringing of the young folks to whose welfare she was pledged. Frances, again, you'll see very similar to Ellen. Her announcement of her birth in 1877, I don't know what that is at this point because the paper is missing on microfilm that would probably have it. She again loved to travel. Her topics, she presented a paper on the Spanish Gardens back in 1931. In 1939, she presented a program on Bali. I mean, she had a wide variety of topics there. I did find in the 1909 paper that she was listed, as you can see, a kindergarten cadet and with schoolwork, and I'm not sure what that was, but it was probably a helper with the teacher because it was listed kindergarten teacher, kindergarten assistant, and then kindergarten cadet. So anyways, she helped there. Plus in 1910 she was on a committee studying medical inspections in the public schools, and they were promoting trying to get a nurse with the school system. So we take that for granted today, but back then they were just trying to get that happening. She did do some state suffrage activities too. I did find that in 1916 she was appointed state press committee of the Suffrage Association. So she was active more at a statewide level. She did do some World War I work. She hosted gatherings at her house where they'd put together bandages for the soldiers to be sent over with the Red Cross, that kind of thing. And her main charge was Betty Gere. She is buried again at Wyuka in the family plot. And her obit, really, other than, talking about how she went to the university, was a member of the Lotus Club and was member of Kappa, Gamma sorority, that sort of thing, basically was all about her big sister Mariel and her father. So there wasn't much information in that. Now, for some interesting things to do with the family homes. This is the Gere family home at 1700 J. I know they were there in 1883. I imagine they were there earlier. Not sure exactly how early. Not sure exactly who's on the front porch, but this was in the Gere family photo collection. And this is where they lived up until the house that we'll talk about in a minute was built in 1892. And some of you are probably thinking, 1700 J, what's there today? Well, I thought I'd look it up for you. That's what's there today. So it's a little bit different view. Now, the Sanborn maps of Ed Zimmer's show that the Gere home was proposed to be built here. In the directories, it said house building. This is D Street, this is 9th, and then this is A Street. And you can see the Gere home was proposed to be here. There were 6 lots. Nothing else was built on them till those bungalows were put in the 20s. And then this is the carriage house sitting in the back. And it stayed put the whole time and still there today. Over here is one of our board members' homes. This is called the Tyler home. And he was listed as the contractor for the Gere home. And here was where Zion Church was that was burnt down. Over here would be Cooper Park if I had the complete map. Over here's where I retired from, Park Middle School. So it's all kind of in the neighborhood there, down close to downtown. I guess he took out a mortgage for $6,000, Ed found. So the house presumably then cost somewhere in that vicinity to be built. This is the 1891 before it's built. You can see how it's pretty squared. But this one here shows a little more angles and stuff that were actually put into the house when it was built. And this is one of the 2 photos I found in the collection at the State Historical Society. And if you note, it has a lovely little upper balcony up here. I love that. The porch goes clear across. And I like this. This shows where the carriage would stop by and pick you up or drop you off right here, the side steps here. They didn't have a covering, but they did have the steps that went down. And it's just a lovely Victorian, Queen Anne style home. Doesn't look like the Tudor home it does today. And you might notice the trees. That's one thing they must have planted right away. And here's the home with the carriage house in the back. And again, you can see the porch going across and the balcony. This one, when I zoomed in, there's a hammock up there and there's one right here. It looked very inviting. So I don't know why they took off the porches, because I thought, well, that'd be kind of fun. And then this is the one interior shot that was in the collection of the home. And this, you can see the gas light fixture up here. I love all the different styles of chairs. I'm wondering if they picked up some of those on their travels. The knickknacks, etc., all look from various places around the world, possibly. And all the different groupings. You can tell they have all their different little groupings for their social gatherings that they had hosted at the house. I did find an article that said the old Gere home was to be moved to a new location in the 1923 Lincoln Star. And the city council had been studying the move, the article said. The house movers filed a $50,000 bond to move the house, so if something went wrong, it was all covered, if they knocked something over. The Mrs. Geres have desired to retain the old homestead on the new site, and the city has found a way to permit the moving. So they worked it out. I've heard other stories. Jim McKee thought the house might have been cut in half, like many of them were in those days, to move them and then put back together. I don't know if it was or not. Bill Wood has some stories he's heard from an aunt on the moving they used mules. I don't know. 1923, they could have had a tractor too with the mules. I don't know. So I'd love to see pictures or more stories about this. I've kind of searched the papers and haven't found any. I did find one other thing, though, related to the move, is that in 1923, the Evening State Journal had an ad, and it said, Charles Gere, hang on a minute, I gotta get the right page. The Gere home, 6 most beautiful lots in Lincoln, half block between 8th and 8th and 9th on D Street being the Gere home. All paving paid. Will be sold as a whole or in single lots, covered with beautiful shrubbery and trees. Possession been given at once. And this opens up a very desirable entire block frontage on D. No other tract so conveniently located to be had in the city. Will probably be sold this week. If interested, call at once. J.H. Humpy of Lincoln Safe Deposit Company, 126 North 11th. I just found that interesting, too, because Humpy is my brother-in-law's great-grandpa, so thought that was interesting. Now, here's the house today. Clark took a wonderful photo. I don't know. And then right up here is the balcony that's closed in. You can see that in the redone entryway. Porch is gone. Fireplace is there, but made to look more Tudor-like. There's kind of a comparison for you. I really had a hard time stretching this as being the same house. I'll tell you, I struggled. But when you look close, you can kind of see some similarities. And there's a close-up of the carriage house. I kind of zoomed in for you. You can see this little ladder here and ladder here. The doors and window open. But that was the carriage house in the back in those days. Here's the carriage house today. The one assessor's photo shows a little lean-to here where they probably parked a car at one time. The current owners have removed that. But that's the carriage house today. And this is the side that would face the house in D Street. And you'll notice that it has the door. And I believe we think the original hardware and brackets and stuff here. And the dormer is pretty fancy, but that's the side that faced the street and the house, presented to the public. It has the fish scale shingles and the fancy window. Even this side, on the side that would face the house a little bit too, faced east, had the fancier siding and the trim. And then as you can see, there's no trim or fancy siding on the alley at the back side. That would be facing west and then facing south. And there's the little oats bin door probably for the oats, and then the Haymow door. And if it was probably on this tract at one time, but now it's just inside, so people can't get in it. But that's the carriage house. And so this carriage house, I'm sure, was very busy with this family traveling all about Lincoln to and from places. I used quite a few sources, and I really learned a lot about the Gere family and the history of Lincoln. I hope you've enjoyed my tour actually through Lincoln more than the Gere family. And I didn't know if you had any questions on the family or anything to do related to the family. Anybody have any comments? Yes.
Question about carriage houses versus early garages. How can you really tell the difference? Is it because of the height of them and how they always have hay storage above? Or?
Yeah, Eileen was asking about the differences between the early garages and carriage houses. Many early garages were actually probably carriage houses turned into garages, is my guess. So sometimes it might be tricky, but yeah, I would say the height. And carriage houses always have that little barn feel to them. And but definitely probably the height, and you might look around and see if there's any remnants of like the Haymow door or the oats bin door or something around, and you could probably tell. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. plug up.